Welcome to this explainer of the historical source material. Okay, today we are unpacking a massive historical secret. Seriously, I want you to completely forget the image of Cleopatra you might know from the movies, the one played by Elizabeth Taylor, the woman whose very name has basically become synonymous with feminine manipulation and dangerous exotic beauty. Yeah, that woman is total historical fiction. What we're actually looking at today is how the real history of one of the ancient world's most rigorously educated rulers was deliberately, meticulously erased. Just look at this number. 9. She spoke 9 languages fluently. And how about this one? 275. When she took the throne, she became the absolute first ruler in her dynasty's 275-year history to actually bother learning the local language of the people she ruled. So there is just this incredibly stark contrast between the Hollywood myth, the naive Egyptian seductress, and the rigorous, historically accurate record. And we're pulling this straight from primary sources like Plutarch, Appian, and Cassius Dio. The historical record tells us she was actually a Macedonian Greek. She was a highly strategic scholar and a brilliant political operator who literally almost outmaneuvered the man who ultimately destroyed her. Basically, everything you think you know about her, it was written by her worst enemy. Which brings us to part 1, the Greek Queen of Egypt. Let's start by dismantling the most basic myth out there, which honestly, most history education just skips entirely. Cleopatra was not Egyptian. She was Macedonian Greek. Her family, the Ptolemaic dynasty, were actually the successors to one of Alexander the Great's generals. So by the time Cleopatra was born in 69 BC, her family had been ruling Egypt for 275 years as a Greek-speaking colonial power. They lived in this totally Hellenistic court in Alexandria, they conducted all their official business in Greek, and they even intermarried within their own dynasty. I mean, we're talking regular sibling marriages here, all just to keep their bloodline quote-unquote pure. They completely, flat-out refused to assimilate. And this quote right here brilliantly illustrates why Cleopatra was such a huge political anomaly. The historian Plutarch actually noted that she required absolutely no interpreter when meeting with foreign ambassadors. She completely broke that 275-year pattern by learning Egyptian, but she definitely didn't stop there. She mastered Ethiopic, Parthian, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Median. And let's be clear, this wasn't just some linguistic hobby. This was a geopolitical strategy of the highest order. It gave her the ultimate advantage in diplomatic negotiations because, well, she didn't have to rely on a middleman. Moving right along to part 2, the scholar and strategist. Let's shift our focus over to her rigorous intellect now, because to really understand Cleopatra, you have to understand her mind. She was an absolute academic heavyweight, and she was operating in an incredibly ruthless environment. She studied at the Museon in Alexandria, which was the research institution attached to the famous Library of Alexandria. Guys, this was the intellectual center of the ancient world, the exact same place that produced Euclid and Archimedes. She wasn't sitting around learning how to charm powerful men. She was deeply studying philosophy, natural science, mathematics, and the actual mechanics of economics. All the things you'd actually need to govern a massively wealthy kingdom whose grain literally fed the Roman world. Oh, and she also mastered advanced pharmacology, the study of drugs and poisons. So why pharmacology? Well, because of a pretty grim political reality. Her own siblings were her primary political threats. In her early 20s, she was driven into exile by her own brother, Ptolemy XIII. And later on, her sister Arsinoe actually declared herself a rival queen, and Cleopatra had her executed. The crucial point here is that pharmacology was quite literally an essential survival skill. Being naive in this kind of political environment wasn't just a weakness, it was fatal. She was a ruthless operator who deeply, deeply understood power. And that leads us perfectly into part 3, alliances for survival. This right here brings us to the part of her story that has been the most aggressively distorted by history. Look, these relationships with Roman leaders, they were not these sweeping romantic love stories. They were strictly about statecraft and sovereign survival. Period. In 48 BC, her kingdom is under existential threat. She's in exile. Julius Caesar arrives in Alexandria with the most powerful military force in the region. So Cleopatra has herself smuggled into the royal palace in a cargo bundle. Now, pop culture loves to paint this as the sexy, romantic stunt, but it wasn't. It was a desperate, highly calculated maneuver just to reach Caesar without being assassinated by her brother's guards. She accurately assessed her options, secured the meeting, and within days, Caesar restored her to joint rule. It was just pure, brilliant geopolitical execution. And you know what? The exact same logic applies to her famous alliance with Mark Antony in 41 BC. After Caesar's assassination, Antony was one of the two most powerful men in Rome. It was entirely a transaction of mutual need. Egypt's sovereignty depended entirely on Roman military protection. Meanwhile, Rome, and specifically Antony, desperately needed Egyptian grain and their immense wealth to finance military campaigns. Primary sources like Cassius Dio and Plutarch both describe this as a working intellectual partnership. Antony was attracted to her mind and her conversation just as much as anything else. They were simply two leaders who desperately needed each other's assets. Now we reach part 4, Octavian's propaganda war. This is where the historical record becomes incredibly dark and honestly incredibly important. We have to introduce the true historical architect of the myth we know today, Octavian. Octavian, who would very soon become Rome's first emperor, Augustus, had a massive problem. He had just won a civil war against his rival, Mark Antony. But the thing is, civil wars were a political nightmare in Rome. How exactly does a Roman general justify killing fellow Romans? It was a massive existential political crisis for Octavian. He required a total top-to-bottom reframing of the conflict. And his solution? It was arguably the most successful smear campaign in human history. To avoid the stigma of a civil war, Octavian just couldn't let Rome think he fought a Roman. So he promoted this official, state-sponsored narrative that Rome had actually fought a foreign queen. He painted Mark Antony not as a legitimate political rival, but as this weak victim of a dangerous, exotic, corrupting seductress who somehow threatened the Republic itself. The Roman sources that we rely on so heavily today, they were written in a Rome that Octavian completely controlled. They totally manufactured this seductress myth to make Cleopatra the perfect, convenient scapegoat. And this is totally fascinating. If you look at the primary Egyptian sources, like temple inscriptions and records, you see an entirely different story. They depict her as a legitimate pharaoh, a true devotee of Isis, and a ruler who was genuinely embraced by the religious establishment. Why? Well, because she had done what literally no Greek-speaking Ptolemy before her had bothered to do. She learned their language and she respected their religion. This wasn't just a fun hobby. It was a hardcore legitimization strategy that earned her genuine religious and public loyalty. To them, she was their actual queen. Which brings us to our last section, part 5, the final political move. So we arrive at the end of her life, and we really need to reframe her death. It wasn't the tragedy of a broken-hearted lover. It was actually her ultimate checkmate against Octavian. Following the devastating defeat at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, Cleopatra attempted to negotiate, mostly to protect her children, but Octavian made it crystal clear. She was going to be taken to Rome alive, and she was going to be paraded in chains through the streets in his military triumph. Now, years earlier, her sister Arsinoe had been dragged through Roman chains, and the Roman crowds actually wept at the sight. Octavian just couldn't risk that kind of sympathy happening again. So, on August 12, 30 BC, Cleopatra took her own life. And given her highly documented expertise in pharmacology, this was more than likely a very calculated poisoning, far more clinical and precise than those dramatic snakebite stories you always hear. By doing this, she completely denied Octavian his spectacle. The geopolitical fallout of this was absolute. With her death, the 275-year Ptolemaic dynasty just ended. Egypt, which had been this incredible sovereign powerhouse, was swallowed up and turned into a Roman province. And Octavian? He became the most powerful man in the world, taking absolute, unquestioned power. But the crazy thing is, that power was built directly on the lies he told about the woman he had just defeated. So what should we really take away from all of this? Well, when we finally strip away Octavian's invention, the real Cleopatra is far more dangerous and far more brilliant than the Hollywood myth could ever be. She was a multilingual scholar of the Mazione. She was a brilliant, deeply pragmatic, and entirely ruthless political strategist. She was the very first Ptolemy to earn genuine Egyptian loyalty. And ultimately, she was the victim of the most successful smear campaign in history. The naive seductress is a complete lie. The brilliant Macedonian queen is the reality. It really makes you rethink how we understand the past, doesn't it? History is so often written by the victors. And in this specific case, the victor desperately needed a monster. So I'm going to leave you with this provocative thought to ponder. Who else in history do you think has been completely, deliberately misrepresented by their enemies?